All right, so today we're going to be covering something called React Redux. And up to this point, we've been writing software mostly in the MVC style. Here, let's see if I have this up. So most of the time, we've been talking about things inside the MVC style, which stands for Model View Controller. Generally, what that means is a user comes onto your site and they click on some sort of link or they go to some URL. That action hits a controller, which basically talks to the models. Those models talk to a database and get data back. They do some calculations. Based off of those calculations, you format your data in a certain way and you shove it out to the views. You make a request, hits the controller. The controller is kind of like the brains. I talk to the database. I talk to the models, which talk to the database. I get some of that data back. I do some other fancy calculations. The main brains of it talks to the database and then puts it out on the screen. And for most people, like we just saw with Granger, they said we have 1,800 applications. 1,800 applications those are not all public-facing applications. With a company of that size, they have a lot of internal things that people are building. And for most software, I would argue that most software is internally facing, meaning it's for the company, for a specific team, for maybe 20 or 30 people. Most software is not meant to be on like the Twitter or the Facebook scale. So MVC works most of the time. However, there's those other companies that we're talking about, like Facebook and Twitter and Airbnb and these humongous companies that have just tremendous amounts of money and many, many millions, if not hundreds of millions of users. On a scale like Facebook, MVC falls apart. Have people used the Facebook Messenger before or are familiar with that technology? So how many times have you gone to the Facebook page and you have a little notification that says you have a message and you click it and there's no message? Right? That's a very well-known bug that exists in the Facebook land. It's pretty annoying, and the reason why that happened was basically there's some aspects of the app is still using the MVC framework. But when you have an app as large as Facebook, MVC is not terribly scalable. So as you add more and more features, your data maps look a little bit more and more confusing. So it's kind of like if a user takes an action on Facebook.com, it hits a controller, and then it might update like 50 different models, right? Like if you like something, it has to update all the posts and all the likes on the posts and they update a lot more models, which then update more views, and you can kind of see like this is more or less what would happen if you were dealing with purely an MVC framework in a scale like Facebook. Somebody comes to your site, they do something, hits a controller, updates like 50 different models, updates 100 different views. That might be, it's, you kind of get the point. It's almost impossible to keep track of everything like this. It's difficult to see which way your data is going in and out at any given point. So once the Facebook engineers saw that this was happening, and it's still a problem today, so it's not like solved in any way, they decided to move into a more streamlined and simple solution called unidirectional data flow with an architecture called Flux. So you can kind of see the difference between one giant MVC framework and Flux. So the Flux, the way that it happens is instead of hitting a controller, and this is the way that React is kind of based off of this, so React is not MVC. I take an action goes to a dispatcher, kind of like your 411 calls. That goes into a store, like a centralized database, and then from there, that impacts your views. Shortly after they created Flux, there's a person named Dan Abramov. And Dan Abramov, I think he's in Europe somewhere right now. He wrote React.js. He was basically saying, I want to take this Flux architecture. He's working on React.js, and he authored Redux, which is the state library that we're going to be working on today. He says, using this Flux architecture, I want to move that into React to create like a centralized way to keep track of all of the state that we have. As defined by Abramov in the Redux citation, Redux is, quote, a state management library with minimal API, but completely predictable behavior. So it's possible to implement logging, hot reloading, time travel, universal apps, record and replay without any buy-in from the developer. You can kind of think of Redux as a centralized state store. So it's kind of like up to this point, app.js had its own state, article teaser had its own state, article had its own state, article list had its own state. So you had to know which component was rendered on the page and which component had a certain state that for the variable that you're working with. Instead of doing that, React has something called Redux, which is one centralized, like you can think of it as a client side, so it lives here on your machine, on your browser. One centralized database store that you can use. So instead of going to app.js's state to find something, or maybe it was an article list, or maybe it was in homepage, or maybe it was in login page, you have one centralized store. So let's get started with that today. There's three big concepts that we need to know. One, state is no longer living on the component level. It's living in one giant immutable store. So you can think of that as a client-based database. Number two is actions. Based on the action that you're taking, it's going to trigger a certain change, and then state is changed to reducer. I'm going to run something called create React app, which we're familiar with. I'm going to call it counter Redux. And as we think of data flow, like before we saw, I got rid of it. When we think of data flow, note that data is unidirectional. It only goes in one way. So that means that data flows down to all the components from one centralized store, and the actions flow up to modify that one centralized store. And as we get involved in today's Redux tutorial, there's a few specific things that you're going to see change right away. Number one is where the state lives. Again, before it was on all of our React components, and now it's going to live in one centralized location. And then number two, it's like, how did we change state before? We used to use something called set state to overwrite the entire state, and now we're going to be using Redux, which means that when we do an action, it's going to trigger a reducer, and that reducer is going to update the Redux store. All right, so we're going to go into counter Redux. We're going to run npm install, npm start. This could take a little bit more time. And it's the last day of construction. Been a long time. Drake was here when we first started. And we had 4 people calling in on remote.
I'm impressed that Michael called into.
What's that?
I'm impressed that Michael was still on.
Michael's didn't call on.
I mean, he was in for.
Oh, okay. Cool. All right, let's. We're going to open up 3 windows here. Let me throw this up to the very end. Get my local host on this first guy here, and subble the counter Redux.
Took me a little bit of time, but finally figured out that I could put the lecture up on the screen right here and be able to see it. So
that's good.
I think that took like somewhere like week 8.
That's all right. All right, so let's start. Remember, the main entry point for any React app starts in app.js. Well, it really starts in index.js, which renders app.js. I'm going to replace that whole thing with this boilerplate code, and we will just kind of take a look step by step. So the first few lines is just like whatever I'm going to be importing. So I'm going to be bringing in my React and the component from the React library, bringing the logo, the CSS style sheet. And right off the top, we have a constructor. The constructor is basically the initialize of the Rails app. We're setting state equal to have a key value pair of counter equal to 0. Now, there are 2 ways of writing the same thing. This is the first time that you're seeing this, but I heard that there is a performance benefit to doing this. If I do this.handle increment, which is this and correspondingly the handle decrement, if I declare it in the constructor function and I bind it to this particular context of the app here, I no longer need to call it down here. So instead of doing the bind this in the render function, it's actually, there's a performance enhancement by putting it inside the constructor.
And you don't have to do throw function either. No.
I don't believe you do. Yeah, I think it's by putting it up here, all of this is bound at this point. So I have a handle increment, which is basically going to say whenever this is fired off, I'm going to set the state to have counter go from what it was to that +1, and then correspondingly the decrement goes up and down. So it's not terribly difficult. And you can kind of see inside of this render function, again, you can do anything outside of the return, but the return is just showing stuff out to the page. You have two buttons. When I click the button that goes up, I'm going to hit handle increment. It'll shove the counter to go up. Otherwise, it's going to go down. I'm going to add a few things to the app.css just to get myself a little bit nicer looking app. Here we go. So this is pretty simple. Like, remember we did this 2 weeks ago and it took everyone forever to get the mute button to work. But now we can just do it really fast. We can do increment, it goes up, decrement, it goes down. So if you take a look over here, you'll see that state currently lives directly inside of our component. And for our very, very small increment and decrement application, it's totally fine. But imagine you wanted to display this particular counter on many different pages. How could we share state from this app.js into other places? We would have to pass in a function from this particular component, which would go into a child component, which would go into another component, which goes into another component, kind of like News Site 6. It kind of got out of hand real easily yesterday. So instead of that, we're going to have Redux, which is one centralized store. So first things first, I'm going to kill the server. I'm going to run npm install --save-dev Redux. That's all you really need to do just to bring all of Redux inside of here.
So Redux is more for large applications.
Yeah, and basically any application where you have to keep track of state a lot. You know, like yesterday when we got to at the very beginning when we were just doing stuff with like one page and one component, like you can keep state on that. That's totally fine. And basically for all of your apps, you could totally just have state directly on the component. But as like yesterday when we were passing like handle login from one parent component into another component, which when you clicked it, it went back up. Like around that point, you might want to use a more centralized thing like Redux. It's basically what's your tolerance for how much you want to manually keep track of state.
Well, even at like News Site 2, we were going down 5 levels of that.
Yeah, and it's good to know how to manually handle state because not everybody uses Redux, but you can kind of see like the mental space that it has to take for you to process that is just way too much. Imagine if you had just one place that all of that state was stored inside. All right, so we've included this here, and we're just going to run npm start. And you can see inside of package.json under dev dependencies, I have added Redux. This is something that whenever we're developing this, we need to have this inside of here. All right, so let's get this set up. So the first thing that we need to do is under source create a file called store.js. Also, we're going to create a new folder called modules. Inside of the modules folder, we're going to create something called counter.module.js. There are a few different file structures that people have developed in order to organize your code. And we're going to be going with a structure known as ducks, where we place all of our action types, action creators, and reducers in the same file, which we'll do that here. Let's just create all of our action types, a section for action creators. What's up?
your store and your module, so that's for every Redux application. Your counter module, that's just specific to this application.
Yep. And then what was it? I said action types, action creators, and reducers. Okay. So let's start off with our action types. So when we talk about this particular counter, what are the two different actions that a user can take? Probably just increment the counter and decrement the counter. Those are the only two things that are possibly going to do anything with state. So I'm going to throw that right over here. So these are the two action types that a particular user can do. So I created two constants, increment counter and decrement counter, equal to the string version of themselves. Next, I'm going to have an action creator. Action creators are functions that can possibly take in information and return objects that are formatted so that you can send that to state. It looks a little something like this. So again, I have action types, which is what the user is going to be doing. And then I have action creators. And these are basically just functions that I'm exporting, increment counter and decrement counter. And they take in information and return objects that are formatted to send to the state later. So this is kind of like the whole area that I'm formatting everything, and then I send it to state. State sends it back to me, and I reformat it again, and I send it back out to my views. Go ahead.
So that's like dispatch?
Kind of like a dispatcher, yeah. And now we talk about our initial state. Initial state is like basically like at the very birth of, you can think of this as the birth of my app when it's first loaded into existence. This is the state that I'm going to have. I'm going to have my counter equal to 0. And then finally, I have the reducer. The reducer is basically the action taker. I'll put that in here. Action taker. The one that actually makes state changes happen. A reducer is basically a pure function, which means that it takes the current state, which is often referred to as previous state, and then returns a new state. So at the very, very core of it, it could look something like this. I have a constant called reducer, which takes a previous state, an action, and then it'll return a new state. You cannot overwrite state like we were doing on the component level. You have to basically, it's an immutable thing, so you have to set it to a new object. You can't just alter it like we were doing before. So due to the fact that our reducer can take a variety of actions, specifically increment and decrement counter, the most efficient way for us to basically take care of that is what's called a switch case. So let's kind of read through this because it's incredibly difficult to understand. So action types, so counter.module.js is basically a module to help you organize all of the thoughts that you have regarding this store. There's 4 things that every single one of these modules has to have. First one is action types, which is like the thing that you're determining what the user can do, just so that this is mostly for you. Action creator is like Aaron said, kind of like a dispatcher. It's like I'm creating a function that may or may not take a payload, and then I'm just passing that in to the reducer down over here. I have an initial state to start off the entire app with regards to this counter, and I have the reducer, which is the action taker. I'm actually going to be doing some sort of action. The reducer takes a previous state, which I'm going to, if there's nothing passed in, it's going to equal the initial state, and then an action that's passed in of some sort. So inside of here, I have a new state, which I'm just going to spread the previous state inside of an object. So again, all I'm doing is I'm just copying. I'm setting new state equal to a spread inside of a new object of the previous state. So when I pass in an action type of increment counter, I'm going to say the new state over here. I'm going to take that counter and set it equal to the previous state's counter, which was passed in +1. And I'm going to return that new state back out. Okay. And maybe if I have another one, so let's say it's a decrement counter. I'm going to do new state dot counter equals previous state dot counter -1. And because we want to use this reducer outside of this module, I'm going to export default reducer at the very bottom. I'm also exporting the increment counter if I want to use it, and the decrement counter if I want to use it as well.
I've seen that switch since
Yeah.
pre-code camp.
Yeah, it's been a long time. So now that we have our action types, action creators, initial state, and reducer, we're ready to set up the store. The setup's pretty straightforward and simple because the Redux library gives us a method called createStore that takes in a reducer and outputs a store. Essentially, it looks a little something like this. I'm bringing in createStore, which is a library from Redux. I'm bringing in the reducer from this counter module that I just created. I'll throw this on the bottom here. And then I'm creating a store that's using this createStore from the reducer. Now I have access to the entire store with all of these action types, action creators, and initial state inside of it. You may be wondering why we didn't like this file is just so simple. Like, why didn't I just move all of this code directly inside of the store.js? Like right now, we only have one reducer for one set of actions, but in the future, you're going to have more than just one counter.module.js. You might have like another action.module.js and then another action.module.js. You don't want to just throw everything inside of one specific file. You want to have all of those in their own individual files. All right, so before we hook up our action creators, let's make sure that we can access store from our app component. So we've created all of the action type creators, initial state, and reducers in this file right here. We've loaded up inside the store, and I want to see if app.js is able to load the entire Redux store inside. So first things first, I'm just going to run import store from store. So I'm here at app.js, and then store.js is right over here. All right, so instead of hard coding our state, because remember our initial state does live inside the store already, which calls in from counter.module. What I'm going to do instead is get rid of the state. I don't want to hard code it just to get started. I want to do this.state is equal to store.getState. Again, I'm not hard coding the object, but I'm actually grabbing it from another centralized location. So every single place has the same starting state. Let's throw maybe a console log right over here. So console log this.state. If all goes well, the initial state that I've set inside of counter.module will show up inside of app.js. So if I go here and load up the page and it console logs, I have an object. Inside the object, I have counter equal to 0. So that matches up with my counter over here. And just to make sure that actually works, I'm going to type in poop just to see if it shows up. So I updated the store, and you can kind of see here's my initial state, counter is equal to poop. So we did bring in everything correctly. I'm going to reset my counter equal to 0. And then we're going to hook up our action creators. So currently, if you take a look here, our buttons are only changing the state on this particular component. So instead of, like, you can kind of see, whenever I click the increment, it's going to fire off this.handleClick, which is going to set the state for this particular component only. I wanted it to update the things all the way up top. So once I hit the handle increment, I'm going to do store.dispatch increment counter. And then correspondingly, this would be store.dispatch increment counter. Now, let's think about this. So store doesn't exist over here. I'm importing it from over here. When I dispatch increment counter, I actually jump into here. Increment counter is called, and then the reducer will start taking shape. Whenever I call increment counter, I'm going to go down to this switch case when it'll say that it's going to be an increment counter. At that point, it's going to increase the state and return the new state, and the same thing with the decrement state. So I'm going, instead of everything happening over here, it's going into the store, which goes into this individual module, and that's going to update a centralized location rather than right here on one small thing.
And then if you change that instant import store from store, if you change it to import boot from store, then you can boot.dispatch.
Pretty much, yeah.
You can import store to any one of your
Any component. That's correct, yeah. And all right, so we've set this up correctly. Let's just see if this works. So I'm going to increment and decrement, and nothing is working. Don't worry yet. It's a pretty easy fix. So if you take a look inside of our component constructor, we initialize our state with store.getState. So when we first start, we are setting our state equal to this, but we're not subscribed to the store's state anymore. So we just set it at the very beginning, we set it and we forget it. But we actually need to subscribe to it so that anytime that the store changes, like the centralized thing that controls everything else, I want to also be updated at that particular point. So I'm gonna hook into component did mount. Add this thing. A little bit of code. This above line basically subscribes us to the store. So it says whenever the store gets updated, I'm going to set the state to store's new state. Let's see if this works. Increment and decrement. This decrement's not working. Did I forget something? Let's see. We have decrement counter, handle decrement. So we have decrement counter. Did I spell it incorrectly?
You spelled the counter wrong on the reducer file. Line 24. Is it ER then account? .count, new state.count.
Tell me these things ahead of time. I would have searched forever for that one. Increment and decrement is still not working. Okay, so let's do some troubleshooting. I'm not sure why that is. So I have import store from store, implement counter.module, handle increment, handle decrement, handle increment. Increment counter is this one up here. Decrement counter is this one here. Let's see, did I export this one correctly?
Do you have a return? You have to have a return after that?
Oh, yeah. Good catch. So refresh up
Or you have to
and
return new state under.
okay, so new state equals that, and then holy, it's typos. Increment, decrement, cool. All right, good catch. So what we did today was we hooked up Redux. We created a counter module with different action types you have, the creators, which are basically dispatchers, the initial state of this particular module, and then what happens when somebody actually wants to fire off this thing. So let's say that I want to fire off, when I do increment counter and I call it, it's going to fire off the function and set the type equal to increment counter. It hits this particular point, it hits the switch case. When it's going to be the increment counter, I'm going to do this thing. When it's the decrement counter, I will do something else. I created a store from that, and a store is filled with many different reducers. Right now, I only have one reducer for counter.module, but I could have some other thing that I can reduce at a different point. So it'd be like reducer 1, 2, 3, 4, and then that store would just include all of these different reducers inside of them. At that point, after that, I brought in the store, I brought in the increment and decrement from the module itself. And I'm basically saying when I fire this off, it's still going to be the same on click, but instead of handling my state directly, I'm going to actually have the store handle the state at that particular point. Then I hooked into the component did mount so that whenever a user takes any specific action, whenever a user takes a specific action and the centralized store is updated, I'm subscribed to it so that it's going to update here on this other component level. One last thing before that's it. What happens when the component unmounts from the DOM? Like when I move to a different page and the component is no longer is mounted onto the screen, I probably want to unsubscribe. I don't want to keep updating things that are no longer on the screen. So luckily.
So why is that needed if it's working correctly right now?
Right now, if I go to another page, this particular component is still connected to the, is still subscribed to the store. So like right now, like let's pretend if you were on the news site and you were on the home page, and then that was subscribed to the store. You move to like the login page, your home page is still connected to your store and you don't need it to be anymore. I'm guessing it's a performance thing.
Okay.
So I want to unsubscribe when I'm no longer on that particular page. Luckily, store.subscribe, remember this was what we had before. I'll just keep that up top for now. Store.subscribe returns a function called unsubscribe. So remember, like when you're doing things like with .map and stuff like that, the result of .map is a new array of things. So similarly, when you do store.subscribe, the thing that's returned to you is an unsubscribe method. So I'm going to create something called this.unsubscribe, which is going to be another method I can call as a result. It's kind of like saying, like, if I have an array of like 1, 2, 3, I would do like new array, updated array is equal to or something like that. I'm mapping over each one. I'm going to set each one to, I'm going to map over each one, set it to 2, 3, 4, and I'm setting updated array equal to that, to the result of this thing here. Similarly, store.subscribe returns an unsubscribe method that's available to you. So this particular line right here is doing two things. One, it's subscribing you directly to the store so that whenever the store updates, the component level's state will change. And then it also gives you access to an unsubscribe method that you can use later. So when the component will unmount, so at the very end of its life cycle, like when I move away from the page and it's no longer on the DOM, you can just call this.unsubscribe, and then it's no longer subscribed at all. Though it's not really crucial for our current simple counter to go up and down, when you have apps that have a lot of different views and a lot of different components, unsubscribing from your unsubscribing when you unmount from the screen is really important to avoid registering way too many listeners and way too many subscriptions at once. And at this point, you may be thinking, that's a lot of extra work just to do the exact same thing that I had right at the beginning. And that's true. The initial setup of Redux is pretty laborious, but as your app scales, as you add more features, as you add more components, managing state in the Redux store is much more manageable than having each individual person manage their state. It's just much easier for that.
So your store.js ends up getting pretty big.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, based on how many modules you're going to have. But it's one centralized location that manages everything, rather than each individual person manages their own thing.
If you go back to counter module,
Mm-hmm.
that first initial state, that's set in stone, that's immutable, and then you just keep update that.
Yes, exactly.